Welcome to the third video covering the development of my Unity game. So to start off with, I made some small improvements to the character model, in particular the seams used to UV unwrap. This was done in order to make texturing the model easier later down the line, and also because this model hasn't been updated since 2016. Next up, I started work on adding the ability to jump. The way I did this was to check, in every update, if the player is falling by performing a raycast. If the player isn't falling and presses space to jump, a force is applied to the rigid body. To avoid the player jumping in the shape of a parabola, which isn't what you would expect in a game, as soon as the player reaches the apex of their jump, another smaller force is applied to the rigid body, to force the player to drop a little bit quicker. With the player being able to place structures, I felt it was important whilst in build mode for there to be a visual indicator as to which structure the player is currently looking at. What I did was add a simple highlight to structures being looked at by the player whilst in build mode. The next thing that I worked on was having the ability for cells to spawn with pre-placed structures. Alongside this, I added an editor-specific drop-down list containing a list of all structures to each cell, to make it easier to choose which cell spawns with which structure when designing levels. As well as that, I introduced the concept of entity ownership. This way, we could have certain structures, such as the keep at the center of the level, be owned by something other than the player, as we don't really want the player to be able to delete or sell that. Continuing with some build mode improvements, I refactored the build mode logic to be clearer and more intuitive to follow, which included some methods to find the cell the player is currently standing on. What this does is allow me to check whether a structure can be placed in a particular cell and give the player feedback accordingly by highlighting a placement in red if it's not possible. With the build mode improvements done, I focused on adding animations to the player next. For this, I created a separate player animations controller component which changes the animation being played depending on the key that the player is pressing. Whilst I know it's possible to change animations within an animator based on the value of variables, for now I've just synced them with key presses. Having animations is great as it gives a more visual indicator to the state that the player is currently in, and I didn't really want to leave them till the end, but instead add them in as I go along. Having finished basic movement, I added a very basic attack state to the player, in which during one frame of the attacking animation, a physics overlap capsule returns the colliders of any enemies in front of the player, and then applies damage to them. In order for enemies to take damage, I introduced a health variable to all entities as well as two interfaces. The eye damageable interface, which allows an entity to take damage, and the eye perishable interface, which allows an entity to perish. At this point I really felt like things were starting to get tightly coupled, and I needed a way for systems to be separate from one another. Events are a really good way of achieving this kind of architecture, and inspired by Ryan Hippel's talk on scriptable objects and the example event system that he coded, I implemented my own. This means if I wanted certain things to happen, like adding points whenever an enemy is killed or playing a sound effect whenever the player takes damage, none of that has to be coded explicitly with having any knowledge of those objects. Instead, an entity can broadcast a particular event, with some payload if that's required, and not care what happens to it. And then any listeners to those particular events will execute their own code each time that event is fired. Now that the player can attack enemy entities, I wanted to refactor the variables related to attack damage from the player to a weapon object. So I created a new player weapon changer component and a weapon object, which allows the player to hold and switch weapons and deal damage according to the weapon being held. Currently it's just a very basic system, just to lay the foundation for weapons in the future. The final couple of things I did was to refactor the player controller component into separate controller components, so each controller can focus on one particular thing. I also added in one new structure, a tar pit, as I want to start working on structures which can affect entities, such as slowing them down. Looking back over the past few weeks of development, I felt that although I had a good idea of where I want to take the project, there isn't much direction and I'm just adding things as I go along. Although the premise of this game is quite simple, it will definitely start to become much more complex. So for the next couple of weeks, what I'm going to do is focus a little bit more on the design and architecture of everything that's going to make the game possible, in order to have a much better foundation to build the rest of the game from.